Now, in 1943, one of the worst so-called race riots in the history of the United States took place here in the city of Detroit. It began on a Sunday afternoon. I believe it was June 20th. And there was a lot of migration from the South, from both the Appalachian regions as well as the Black Belt areas into the city of Detroit. So there was a lot of competition for housing, a lot of competition for jobs. Racial tensions were extremely high during that time period. And this was the days of war production, when the auto companies had been converted to producing the tanks and the ships and the guns necessary to arm the U.S. military to fight against Germany and Japan during World War II. So when the 1943 riots broke out, the dividing line was Willard Avenue, right out here. And you had a lot of black people who were beaten to death by white mobs and by the police. And they called the National Guard in a day or two later after the riots commenced, after they began. And the National Guard actually facilitated this type of racist violence against black people here in the city of Detroit. When the riot was over in 1943, I think there were like 45 African Americans were killed and about 10 whites were killed in that whole situation. Black people had to set up, I've heard older people talk about this. They set up their own defense units in the African American community to protect them from racist mobs that were coming into the community and engaging in this type of racist violence. So the National Guard was actually called in to put down the riot. That's how severe it was in 1943. And we had these other racial outbreaks that took place in other parts of the country. In Los Angeles, there was one also called the so-called Zoot Suit riots that involved Mexican Americans and whites during that same particular time period. Now, after the conclusion of World War II in 1945, the United States was in a position where it became the dominant capitalist and imperialist country above and beyond any other country in the world. Europe had been largely devastated as a result of the war. London was bombed extensively. Germany had been destroyed. The Soviet Union, which had fought valiantly and had sacrificed over 20 million of its own citizens to defeat fascism during World War II, was another center of power. But they had been weakened tremendously as well as a result of the bombing of Soviet territory by the Nazis between 1941 and 1943. So after 1945, the U.S. became the dominant capitalist power in the world. And it led to a lot of expansion, economic expansion, internally as well as internationally. At the same time, we had efforts to build suburbs in the United States. We had the Federal Highway Administration that actually provided funding to build the expressways that we have now that go through these major urban areas. A lot of these expressways ripped right through African American communities. The main African American community in the city of Detroit was near downtown. It was called Paradise Valley, and another was called Black Bottom. Both those communities were destroyed as a result of the expressways that went through the African American community. This was actually financed by the Federal Highway Administration under successive Republican and Democratic administrations. So we had the whole suburbanization of America during this particular time period in what became known as urban renewal, which many people call Negro removal, where they would just come in and clear out whole neighborhoods of African Americans, destroying small businesses, destroying churches, destroying social clubs, and moving people into more crowded and more demographically dense areas. And that's what happened here in the city of Detroit. All during the late 1940s, during the 1950s, leading up to the early 1960s. Now, as a result of this, tremendous anger built up in the African American community in the city of Detroit and throughout the country. In the early 1960s, the civil rights movement became a key factor here in the city of Detroit. In fact, in 1963, the first mass demonstration, civil rights demonstration, took place here in the city of Detroit. Over 200,000 people marched down Woodward Avenue to Cobo Hall. They were led by Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was head of New Bethel Baptist Church, James Del Rio, Walter Reuther was a part of that demonstration as well as other civil rights and labor leaders. In fact, Dr. King gave his first I Have a Dream speech here in the city of Detroit on June 23rd, 1963, which is actually the anniversary of that is today, some 47 years later. Then, 2 months later, they went to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered on August 28th of 1963. So Detroit played a key role in that whole civil rights struggle, as well as the labor struggle to build the UAW and other powerful labor unions, and also in terms of black political power here in the city of Detroit. Detroit played a very key role in that whole development process during the 1960s. Now, where are we at today? In 1967, we had a large-scale urban rebellion here in the city of Detroit. 43 people were killed, over $1 billion in property damage. It accelerated the so-called white flight to the suburbs, even though it had began extending as far back as the late 1940s and early 1950s with this funding of the Federal Highway Administration, the GI Bills. They actually encouraged whites to leave the city of Detroit to move into the suburbs. So Detroit lost a lot of tax revenue, they lost a lot of businesses, and then at the same time we had large-scale capital flight that took place even beginning as early as the 1950s. So a lot of times you'll hear that the early rebellions actually sparked white flight and deindustrialization. That's totally false. The decline of Detroit was taking place long before the 1967 rebellion. In fact, the 1967 rebellion was symptomatic of the economic decline of Detroit. So after 1967, we had a major push on the part of the African American community to take over the city politically. This took place, culminated somewhat in 1973 with the election of Coleman Young and also the key election of key city council people in the city of Detroit, like Irma Henderson, for example, who was also a progressive fighter, who was elected and became president of Detroit City Council during the 1970s. But at the same time, we had this massive capital outflight. We had this essential blockade of the city of Detroit because of disagreements over its political policies. So Detroit declined precipitously over a period of about 3 decades. So this is where we are today. And we have other factors that have kicked in over the last 5 to 6 years. The predatory lending schemes that have further eroded the housing stock and drove down property values in the city of Detroit. We also have, as I mentioned before, the crisis in education. And at the same time, we have growing police repression here in the city of Detroit. So what have we been doing? And I want to just touch on this and conclude. The Moratorium NOW coalition to stop foreclosures, evictions, and utility shutoffs have been in the vanguard of the fight back movement here in the city of Detroit. We've been fighting home foreclosures. We've been fighting for a federal jobs program to address the massive unemployment, where we outstrip any other city in the United States of America in terms of joblessness. Recently, we've also been fighting these efforts to further downsize the city. They want to move into areas where you have large-scale home foreclosures, business closures, abandonment of industrial facilities, to raise all these areas, to take federal money to do this, to tear down all these buildings, tear down all these homes, and to actually relocate people who still live in these communities into other areas of the city of Detroit. And what is their plan in terms of dealing with this vacant land, these vacant industrial centers? Well, one plan is just to take this vacant land and fence it off, and then sell it off to land speculators, and they can come in and do whatever they want to do with the land. They also floated a scheme about industrial farming, where they would have these soil beds, and they would grow various industrial products where they could market both nationally and internationally.